You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome, everybody. This is I Love You Keep Going. It is 7:35 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. It's 7/18/2024, July 18th, 2024. And I thought that I would talk a little bit about the nature of cognitive-oriented practice versus procedural-oriented practice, and particularly in light of the attachment work that we do. But I think it also applies to any of the meditation practices. In Buddhist philosophy, there are 7 paths for enlightenment, and only one of them is meditation oriented. In the West, we get very biased toward meditation as the only path toward enlightenment, but in traditional communities, that isn't the case. One of them is a cognitive way of going, which is simply to understand the teachings, understand the Dharma, and in that way work into a place of liberation. Some people like name is not popping up, but some people in the West also talk about a kind of struck enlightenment that happens, so that you also don't need to take the path of meditation, and also the path of service, not giving you a complete list. My experience of working cognitively is that it only works in low stress environments, because if you get too much stress, it has a negative impact on the cognitive mind's functioning, and you're then stuck really in the unfiltered procedural memory. And that procedural memory just has a catalog of strategies that you use to manage the experience of the present moment as it unfolds. And we get that conditioning very early on. Really, I'm not going to argue for or against neonatal experience, before birth experience, but certainly the diet and the stress and the conditions that the mother has, the birth mother has, will affect the development of the child. And then the child is born, depending on the quality of the environment, they develop in response to it. Human babies are a marvelous thing in the sense that they're born with their brains only partially developed. This is different than most mammals. And so that we have the unusual experience of our brains forming in direct relationship to the environment, not just through the birth mother taking care of us, and then we're born with these capacities that are instinctual in so many other species. But our brains develop in direct response to the experiences of the environment that we have, the care that we're provided with. And that lays down these deep procedural tracks. Human babies don't really have a sense of who they are. And there isn't really a mechanism in humans to be able to see ourselves clearly. We really see ourselves mainly in the reflection of other people. And that process also starts very young. That spontaneous, authentic calling out to the world for the care that we need without even knowing what that care is, and then understanding in that very primal way the way that the care is delivered and creating a representation of ourselves based on the experience of the care that we receive, and valuing the kinds of requests and for care that we have based on the way that we're responded to. And so if you have a resourced, rested, focused, capable caregiver, the experience of requesting care and receiving care is very different than if you have a stressed, resourceless, incapable caregiver, and how they view the same request for care. It's not that the care for one baby is greatly different than another, but the environment. Some babies settle and are quite easy in the sense that they don't develop colic and they're not overly sensitive to the environment. Some babies that do develop colic have a lot of pain in the beginning of life as the digestive system comes online. And so they need a higher level of care at that time. Or some babies have a sensitivity to the sensing experience, which requires a greater control of the environment so that they're not overwhelmed by the sensory stimulus that happens. So in the beginning, where there isn't this cognitive ability to learn, we really are in a process of laying down these tracks of procedures and the way to request something to try and elicit the care that you need, even before there's a conceptual capacity for a framework to talk about this stuff. So somewhere along the way, the brain develops and you develop these capacities for a cognitive mind. You develop a capacity for autobiographical reference, autobiographical memory. Let's say the earliest would be 3-ish or so, but most people it's 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. And then we learn these procedures. Procedural memory, is pretty good at the things that the tasks that you need to perform that the body learns to do, like walking. When was the last time you actually had to think so much about walking? Injuries aside, you sprain your ankle and suddenly walking becomes something that you have to think about and manage. But if your feet are in good shape, your legs are in good shape, your hips are in good shape, your balance is in good shape, once you learn the process of walking, you can just do it without thinking. That's the procedural memory. It doesn't have to engage the cognitive memory. The autobiographical. Do you remember learning to drive a car? If you did, 2 hands on the wheel, checking your mirrors, sort of sliding out into the road. Everything had to be monitored. And once you learn to do it, of course, now you can drive without thinking about it, go from place to place, changing the radio, sipping your latte. But when we really break that down and begin to examine how that happens, I like to talk about it in this procedure of forming conceptual reality, which is you have the capacity to sense something, the object that can be sensed when there's contact, consciousness of that sensing experience arises still before the self experience, just pure sensing. And then it's evaluated for urgency. There's a whole quality of memory that's in the body, that's in the muscles, that precedes the brain stem, pushing stuff along to be processed. And then the ordering of urgent, Does it need immediate attention? Does it not matter if we ever get to it? Neutral. Is there time for a pleasant experience? And then that raw, unfixated, undefined, meaningless sensing experience is compared to the perceptual database. And if there's an entry in the database that's close enough, a whole thread of meaning attaches to that sensing experience, and then it's fixated into conceptual reality, which has meaning to it, has narrative to it. What also comes along with this is the intention for the response to it. And then the action that we take in response, the intention. And then we gather the results, the outcome of the action that we take. The self-experience engages just as conceptual reality is unfolding, and it really is the witness that evaluates whether or not the whole unconscious process, that whole procedure that just unfolded, is a good idea or not. And if it's not a good idea, you have that moment of intervention before the intention is translated into an action. And we would say in Buddhist thought that you create karmic threads that you may have to deal with for 1,000 lifetimes, let's say. Or did you ever just catch yourself in the middle of a sentence that you knew that if you finished, it would be a disaster, and so you fudge it into some other thing? There's like this clumsy beginning of a sentence jammed into the end of another sentence. There's a politeness that we all engage in around these kinds of constructions. We let it go. So part of this process of understanding the nature of everything, to see clearly the human condition and what we're faced with, is to begin to watch that process so that we can see the meaning that we're assigning to the present moment experience. We don't really live in what's happening, and we live in what it means to us. And what it means to us is that combination of the autobiographical memory and the procedural memory. One way to tell the difference is you might think that somebody is not coming, and or not fulfilling an obligation that they made to you. Because of a tardiness or a way that they respond, that would be an evaluation of a cognitive evaluation of events or things that are being said that are unfolding. But then the body-mind takes over with this habit of feeling rejected, this habit of feeling unworthy, this habit of despair that you'll always be alone, which is the procedural amplification of the interpretation of the present moment. So there is some value in pulling these things apart so that you can see when that sweeping energy of the procedural responses is beginning to activate, so that you can circumvent it. We do tend to, when we create these conceptual realities, create these built into that intention and action is also the expectation of the outcome, which is the procedural part of making sense of things. One aspect that's also important to talk about is the imagination. The procedural database is only good if you have entries in the database that are applicable to the present moment situation. It's quite ordinary, and those of us who really like novel experience tend to go for things where there isn't much track record associated with it, so it has a freshness to it. But when there's no entries or a series of entries in the procedural database in order to understand and make meaning, then the imagination kicks in and begins to create new meanings. And one of the things that happens to people who face adversity in their early life is the imagination is pinched off. And so we don't have the capacity to imagine solutions or assign meaning to experiences in the present moment. It can produce a kind of helplessness, which is strongly associated with preoccupation, but also that inhibition and restriction around the capacity to explore is strongly associated with preoccupied people. There's the part of childhood where you really don't learn how to explore. And there's also the part of childhood where exploration was interfered with. And so there's strong negative associations associated with the project of exploration. And then because those can be quite painful, we begin to pinch off the imagination around how to explore as a way of reducing the pain of life. What we don't maybe understand is that the meaningfulness of life really comes from that capacity to explore, and we really need it to feel engaged and alive. And if we don't have it, what comes instead is a kind of despair at the difficulties of things. So one of the reasons why I am such a proponent of meditation is because it really does work mainly in the perceptual database, and you can change the way that the database responds to the current experiences of the present moment so that you create different meanings, and you can work at it to change the expectations of the way things will turn out. And when you change those things, you create these realities that are starkly different from the ones that are habitual based on that early conditioning. One of the things that happens is you make up your mind, let's say that as a phrase. You, from conditioning, anticipate, often rightly, what the outcome of certain gestures in your family system might be. And so you begin to inhibit the expression of those because the anticipated outcome is unpleasant, and you are avoiding it, really. But as you move outside of the family system into the world, if you don't notice actually that you're creating these afflictive expectations of what could happen and the restrictions that are involved in that, you restrict your exploration, your involvement in the present moment based on those conditioned responses from the past, and reinforce the experience around your expectation, a kind of self-fulfilling activity. When we use meditation to create these different entries in that perceptual database, when the body-mind goes to the perceptual database to see if there's something close enough to it that we could make meaning out of it, there's very well reinforced these beliefs of what can happen. And when you use meditation, you put these little filaments of alternatives in there. And then if you use those to create the experience of reality, of course, you have an actual experience, not something that's purely visualized or purely from the process of meditation that creates. just listening to my dog chewing something, but something he can chew. You create these little filaments, and if you use them as references for creating the meaning in the present moment, you then generate an actual experience, which is also remembered. And so the process of building up or changing the perceptual database happens through these tiny experiences of meditation, but over time, as you use them more and more to create the reality that you respond to, the more robust that they become, because they're based now on actual experiences, not just on the visualization aspect. The most successful series of meditation practices around really adapting the perceptual database is the ideal parent figure protocol. But we do also need to attend to developing mentalizing and emotional regulation, so that we can track things fast enough to notice when we're in a beneficial response and in an afflictive response, so that we can stop the afflictive responses faster and faster and maneuver the body-mind response into the beneficial responses. Because the pure sensing experience does not contain an intrinsic meaning, we're very dependent on this process of assigning meaning to the present moment experience. And what you'll begin to notice if you do this is that the way that you can make reality is extremely plastic. You can make it in all sorts of different ways. In fact, you can create an experience of present moment reality, mentalize around it, see clearly that it's not a good version of reality, drop it, and reimagine the present moment experience immediately. And it takes on, as it is transformed into conceptual reality, these very convincing elements to it. You know, you can walk around in the world and think it's solid, and that your perception of it is actually what's happening. This would be a low mentalizing response. But can you track fast enough the thinking process that you understand what it is that you took in to create that string of mind moments that you're assigning meaning to? Can you create the meaning and then examine the meaning and validate that it is close enough to the sensing material that you took in that it would be reasonable to make that meaning? Or can you recognize when that actually didn't happen and reflect and reevaluate what's actually happening, so that by the time you hit the process of intention and action, you're actually in a pretty good evaluation of what's going on, you're understanding the meaning, and you're actually able to then engage in a process of communicating those experiences to someone else. In the Theravada Buddhist model that I mainly teach in the Satipatthana Sutta, in the refrain, it says mindfulness of inside, mindfulness of outside, mindfulness of inside and outside. And what we're really talking about is mindfulness of inside, the experiences that we have of ourselves moment by moment. Mindfulness of outside is the experience of other people. Self and world in the Buddhist frame, self is you and the world is all of the other people. That's what we're really talking about. Mindfulness of inside, mindfulness of outside, mindfulness of inside and outside, which is describing this process of communication between people. So if you look at Christian.
George, I've never I guess I've never read the suttas, maybe I should. Can you unpack the mindfulness of inside and outside piece? Because like maybe I'm a little in my head about this, but I think of like if if there's an outside, I only experience it through my inside's interaction with the outside. So like the inside's always kind of included in that. Um, that's my silly gloss. So can you explain what that actually is in the sutta?
Um, we really do exist in this relationship between the capacity to sense things and the meaning that we assign to them. Some sensations are within the body and some sensations are outside of the body. That one makes sense.
Some sensations are outside the body?
Well, the source of the sensation could be
Okay, yeah,
internal,
right.
or the source of the sensation could be external. Uh, we're really limited in terms of the way that we know things. Um, as I like to say, the spectrum of sound is vast and we can hear a tiny sliver of it. The spectrum of light is vast. We experience a tiny sliver of it. The spectrum of temperature is vast. We can survive in a tiny sliver of it. And so we have a way of taking in and understanding the world. And because we're mainly in relationship to humans at a level where we can understand the experience of other people, they can describe to us the experience of other things that make sense to us. We can assume that all things are like that. But you may have seen on the internet depictions of what a bee sees, or a dragonfly sees, or you could be talking to your dog expecting a reasonable response from your inquiries in your language that you use, and not necessarily be able to understand the way in which they communicate. So we can get very claustrophobic in our perception of what's happening. But if I use the frame of an adult level of mentalizing, you understand within yourself the way that you're understanding, the way that you're decoding the experience of the present moment. You understand the meanings that you've assigned to the experience of the present moment. And you understand what you would like to express about that experience to someone else. You know, that process of understanding what it is and then making an expression of it and seeing that our expression is received and people respond to it. It starts in infancy. I mean, it's that mechanism of authentically expressing ourselves to someone, and they're responding to it, so that we have the experience of having an effect on the world, on other people. This can get quite bashed up, and for a lot of people, it is quite bashed up, and so they don't really track these processes particularly. But at an adult level of mentalizing, where you really are capable of exchanging meaning with other people, that first piece is really understanding your experience and why you've arrived at your interpretation of what's happening. Is that making sense? The second piece is, how do I express that to the person I want to express it to so that they understand what I mean? Because everybody's conditioned differently and everybody's meaning is slightly different based on the conditioning that they experienced. When you get to know other people, what you begin to understand about them is that their point of view and your point of view are different, because they're based, their meanings are based on their conditioning and your meanings are based on your conditioning. And the better you know somebody, the more capable you are of transliterating your authentic expression into something that they will understand what you mean. And then you make the expression, and then you track how that expression lands. You want to make sure that they're actually getting what you're communicating, which means you have to inquire what their response is. And then to complete that process, you take in their response, and hopefully they're communicating it to you in a way that you really understand what their meaning is. And there may be some exchange about that. But let's say you're good at it with each other, and you're able to express yourself so that you're understood, and they're able to express themselves so that they're understood. Then the fourth piece is you modify your understanding of what's happening between you based on those exchanges. So that would be what I would call mindfulness of inside, mindfulness of outside, and mindfulness of inside and outside. That makes sense.
Okay.
We really do know how we're doing, and how we're being perceived, and where we're at from those reflections of other people. So what we also want to do is put ourselves in a position where we have a robust group of people around us who will feed back to us that vital information of how we're actually doing, and not find ourselves in a situation where we're actually being manipulated because the reflections back are not accurate.
So maybe you can let me know if this is in any way a good way to put it. Maybe mindfulness of insight is like the interaction of subjectivity with itself. Mindfulness of outside is the interaction of subjectivity with objects outside of itself.
Right?
Then mindfulness of inside and outside is interaction between subjectivities.
Yes.
Okay.
The more accurate it is, the closer you are to actually what's happening, and the more skewed they are, the less you really understand what's happening. And when you look at it in an attachment frame, security produces this kind of reliable exchange, and insecure and disorganization negatively affects that pretty dramatically. But because the way that, say, for instance, dismissing people navigate the emotionality of living through suppression, they don't find a lot of means of evaluating whether the information they gather from outside is useful to them or not. So they tend to operate on internal working models, so that they take in what's there and they express themselves, but they're not engaged so much in the response of the other person. They're engaged mainly in evaluating whether or not they get what they want from the situation. And if they don't, they tend to modify their understanding of what's happening and try something else. But it isn't based on the complex feedback. It's based more on whether they get it or they don't. With preoccupied people, they're also not in that full exchange, but really just monitoring whether they're getting what they want. But they don't really evaluate and maneuver the responses so much as just try a slightly different approach. And that the hectoring strategy that they often use is meant to just break down the resistance to get them what it's much less managed in that way. The disorganized people really have a hard time expressing themselves because it's such a frightening experience for them. So they can easily go either into freeze or into just doing without, really. Does that make any sense? So using ideal parent figure as an example of how meditation practice can really affect the procedural database is that we go into these visualizations and we call up the meanings that are in the perceptual database, the procedural database. And then we activate the richness of them and the meaning of that. And then we layer in around that alternatives to that kind of historical understanding. And the more we layer around these alternative versions, more secure versions of possibility to respond, the body mind, when it goes through that cycle of creating conceptual reality, can pull from one of these slivers, these filaments of possibility, and then create a reality from that rather than using the habitual ways of defining things. And what you see in that moment of contrast when you create a reality from the experience of the present moment, which is not defined by the conditioned response, is your capacities may be quite different than you think, so that there's insight into the capacities that you have, that you may have unintentionally over the course of a lifetime undermined because you didn't expect to be able to have the kinds of things that you wanted from that early conditioning response. And so that you're acting differently and the world is responding to you in a very different way because you've created these realities, and then you have these deep insights into the nature of the human condition, which is really in this understanding of enlightenment that we talk about in Buddhist practice, which is you're creating these experiences of reality, and that they're dependent on the way that you assign meaning, and then you can begin to change the way in which you assign meaning, which opens up really a pathway to seeing each moment, even the ordinary ones, constantly the ordinary ones, with this deep sense of sacredness that arises when you really penetrate into that place of this one wild and precious life that you're in, leaving out the metaphysical framework for a moment and just being in the experience of this life. And then seeing in that process the preciousness of things. And suddenly this idea of mindfulness of inside and mindfulness of outside, mindfulness of inside and outside, takes on a preciousness, a sacredness that may have been missing before. There's this capacity for openness, moving in a place of vulnerability and also understanding who's reasonable to do that with and who isn't. So that's why I like it. You start with the attachment stuff and you work through that. You develop an understanding of the way in which the cognitive mind is useful, and the way that the procedural mind is useful, not identifying too strongly with either and not relying on one over the other, but doing the things that are necessary to create a balance between them. That all making sense? So that Mettagroup practice that I like to promote on the heart side, the loving kindness side, we're really developing the capacity for positive experience. Positive experience, like negative experience, creates an emotional response. And if you find that positive experience is dysregulating the way that negative experience can be dysregulating, you may find that you're restricting the vehicles for really intensely positive experience, because the dysregulation that comes from it is too much. And so developing these capacities for really intense positive experience that isn't then dysregulating. Christian?
Do you think that to a certain extent, everyone kind of has this, that they need to expand their window of tolerance for positive experiences? Or is it that they got specific, like there was something in the way that their caregivers reacted to their positive expressions that kind of shut those down? Or like, why is it that that would become, it doesn't seem intuitive to me, even though I understand that it's true, but it doesn't seem intuitive to me that positive experiences would dysregulate people.
Well, I think that if we take the positive negative division off, any kind of strong emotional response to something that's happening will fall within the window of tolerance or exceed the window of tolerance. And then your family system will have strategies for regulating that kind of intensity. The better those strategies are, the more resilient you'll become in terms of being able to manage those kinds of experiences, and maybe even expand the capacity for the intensity. And the positive system and the negative system are two different systems, and we are biased in this human body that we live in toward the managing the negative experience. So it's quite ordinary for people to not develop a strong enough capacity for the positive side of things. If you grow up then in a secure household, that would be true, even though the conditions were better. And then if you grow up in insecure, disorganized households where there's a lot of adversity, the focus is not so much on developing the positive capacities. And because there are two different systems, you have to work on both of them. Often in the Theravada communities that I've been involved in, the main focus was on insight practice. And I know for half the time I studied with Shinzen, he was convinced that if you just did the insight side, that would lead to enlightenment that would relieve the need for an intentional development of the positive side. But I don't think that that actually panned out, and the balance, if you look at it, are you in good balance between the positive and negative side, or are you lopsided in some way? If you're lopsided toward the negative side, you should just do enough of the heart practices that you rebalance it, or I would even recommend that you move yourself into a lopsided position where you have a great capacity for positive experience. And the litmus test of that is when something goes wrong and you listen to the mind respond to it, is it responding in a kind and loving way that's actually helpful, actually useful for you responding, or do you go into a kind of negative dive? And if you do go into a negative dive, then you should at least be spending half of your practice on developing the capacity for positivity. You can stay in balance and also consistently respond in a positive way to what the world presents, which is, big and scary, unpredictable. How can you stand on the groundless ground and be responsive? One way to do that is to create over and over these realities that are mainly on the positive side of things. Make sense? Christian?
So this might be kind of a half formulated question, but if you're either on the positive or maybe on the negative side, if you're having a negative experience and you have expanded your window of tolerance, then does that mean that you're just able to kind of, without mediation through some maybe masking emotion or thing that you do, you're just taking that in sort of directly, or you're feeling the emotion directly? Or are you actually in the moment like using a strategy that kind of tamps down uh the emotion for you? Does that make sense the way that I'm asking that?
If you stay within the window of tolerance, you don't need to mask or evacuate from the present moment. And so the intention and action can be informed around the conditions of the present moment, and you can attend skillfully to the stressor of the present moment. Whereas if you get swept up into some kind of a self-generated emotional regulation response, you could lose awareness of the present moment. And then the responses that you make to what's happening are going to be related to the self-generated emotional response rather than to the conditions of the present moment and what might be skillful to change the conditions of the present moment.
Okay, great.
That's really where you want to see clearly, you want to be able to mentalize clearly that's what's happening, so that you are able to stay in the present moment and take action that's related to the present moment, rather than taking actions that are related to the constructions that you make to regulate the experience that's dysregulating. So why don't we stop talking and do a little meditation practice, right? Let go of the meditation. So in July, we have a meditation and addiction level 2 class starting. It's going to be Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays from 6 to 7 p.m. Pacific time. I will do a didactic on Monday, a meditation instruction on Wednesday, and a process group on Fridays. And we'll go over the 4 modules that we talk about in our meditation-based, attachment-focused relapse prevention program. The first is craving and urging, which is really about understanding emotional regulation and how that's conditioned, stress, anger, and depression, understanding how using thought-based regulating strategies, particularly if they produce intense negative emotions, tends to create a cycling depression that is a main conduit for relapse to get out of the depression. We have persistent negative emotions, which is really beginning to address the somaticized emotional experience that often produces a lot of negative affect. And then the fourth one is difficult interpersonal relationships, which is really about the attachment conditioning that leads to addiction, mainly around adopting avoidant strategies, either in an organized way or disorganized way. In August, we're going to start a level 2 class on Tuesday afternoons. The mentoring section of that class is already full, but there are some places open for just taking the classes. And then in September, we're starting a level 2 meditation and attachment, which is going to be on Friday mornings. And that's mainly for the people who are on the East Coast or in Europe, a better timing for that. There's places both in the mentoring side and just in the class side for that. I'm also going to do some half-day workshops on exploration. So really take a deeper dive into the nature of exploration, understanding the difference between primary exploration and secondary exploration. And then I'm going to talk about, in the second one, the development of the creative person versus the blocked person. So a lot of times conditioning, adverse conditioning prevents us from this spontaneous, authentic experience of ourselves, from the creative aspects of life, both in the spiritual side, but also in the manifestation of primary exploration, where you really do need to have that freely flowing creative experience. And so we look at the ways that exploration can be impacted around that. So that, I'm going to use my exploration in photography to describe that process of that creative exploration. You don't have to be an artist or interested in making art. That creative energy really illuminates all aspects of life, and including the pursuit of spiritual insight. So I think it's an important thing. And I think that that's pretty much everything that's coming up in the next half a year. Take a look at it. I offer this teaching freely, but I do hope that if you can support it, you'll support it. There's a donation button on the website. Any amount is appreciated. Thank you for your practice. I hope to see you soon on the path. Bye now.